Russian President Vladimir Putin today making it official. He just formally suspended Russia's involvement in its last remaining nuclear arms control treaty with the United States. That move coming after a rare admission from President Putin about losses on the battlefield in Ukraine.
Unfortunately, there are losses in our ranks. The leadership of the FSB must do everything to provide additional support to the families of our fallen comrades.
On that battlefield today, the eastern city of Bakhmut is a flashpoint. President Zelensky calling the battle, quote, challenging. Ukrainian soldiers paint a much more dire picture to CNN, saying the situation is, quote, 100% worse than what's being reported. CNN's Melissa Bell is live for us on the ground in the Ukrainian capital of Kyiv. Melissa, what's the latest?
Well, hellish is the way another Ukrainian soldier described it to CNN. John, the picture they paint is really pretty horrendous. What you're talking about is a town that's been the subject of fighting for so many weeks now. The conditions there have worsened as the ground has thawed. There's flooding in some areas, impossible roads in others. But there's Ukrainian soldiers that saying, look, we're holding firm despite Russian claims. They say Russian forces, even though they've been sending their most battle-hardened regular, but also Wagner mercenaries to try and break through Ukrainian defenses, the Ukrainian soldiers saying they simply have not encircled us yet, and that there are still two roads through which they continue to get their much-needed supplies, even though they're coming under enemy fire. But really, a very grim picture being painted about what those Ukrainian forces are facing as they try and hold firm. Now, for several days now, we've been hearing growingly desperate pleas for more allied equipment and help in the shape of F-16s. Now, of course, Washington's ruled those out, but we do know that there is other weaponry coming online fairly quickly. We've just been hearing from an American official speaking to the Armed Services Committee saying that it is some 4,000 Ukrainian soldiers that have now been trained, not just in the United States, but in Europe, across Europe, on the Patriot systems, for instance, on the Leopard tanks. And of course, those are expected to make a big difference. The question is just how quickly, when they will be usable here in Ukraine, and what happens in the meantime, specifically for those soldiers who are very bravely trying to hold out against increasingly determined and numerous Russian troops. John.
Melissa Bell, live for us in Kyiv. Melissa, thank you so much. Let's get some perspective now from Lieutenant General Mark Hertling. He served as Commanding General for U.S. Army Europe and the 7th Army. General, grateful for your time, especially on this day. You just heard Melissa explain what we're hearing from soldiers on the ground. President Zelensky himself calls it challenging. If I could ask the control room to put the map back up. When you look at Bakhmut and where it is in southeastern Ukraine, if you're in the room trying to debate military strategy here, is it smart maybe to give it up and then come back and fight another day, or is holding it of some strategic, whether it's strategic on the battlefield or strategic in terms of public opinion, public morale, to keep it?
Yes, John, all of the above. What we're talking about is an inconsequential city. Before the war, it was a population of about 70,000. It's a small area, small city on the intersection of a couple of roads and near some railroads for resupply. It is not strategically important, but it has become strategically imperative to hold by the Ukrainians and certainly by the Russians trying to take it. I would equate this somewhat like Bastogne during World War II, the Battle of the Bulge. The city itself was not critical, but holding on to it. The Ukrainians saying, we are not going to give this up. We're going to suck a whole lot more Russians into this malaise and cause more problems is important to them, certainly. And the Russians need a victory that they have not been able to achieve. John, how long have we been talking about the city of Bakhmut? It's been months now, and the Ukrainians continue to hold on to it.
And so in that context, you talk about Putin could use a win, even if it's a small one. When you hear, it's quite obvious that Russia has suffered huge losses on the battlefield over the last year. Now we're into the first month of the second year of this war. Yet to hear Putin say it so publicly, acknowledging, what does that tell you? Who's that aimed for in your view? Is it aimed at trying to keep up military morale, saying, I hear it, I understand you're hurting, and some of your families have suffered profoundly? Is it about public opinion, all of the above?
Well, it's all of the above also. But here's the context of Putin's speech today. Today, he was talking to the FSB, which is the organization that followed on to the KGB, a group that he was once a part of. So what he was talking about casualties was just one part of that speech. He was also telling the FSB increase the supervision and oversight of the Russian population. And he was doing this on a day when Ukrainian drones were flying over Russian cities, by my count, 12 different cities. A few days after, there was a successful Ukrainian-Russian strike against a Russian airwax plane in Belarus. And the fact of the matter is that Putin is seeing more and more demonstrations against what's happening, and that's going to increase as more and more dead bodies come home to Russian mothers. So what Putin is basically saying today is, yeah, we're having problems on the battlefield, and he's telling the FSB, increase the things you're doing to put down the Russian population, the Russian citizens. So it is not a good sign for Mr. Putin today, in my view. He's having some problems back home.
General Hertling, as always, sir, thank you for your time.
Vladimir Putin delivered a major speech a short time ago to the FSB, that is Russia's Federal Security Service. Putin admitted that members of the FSB have actually been killed in Ukraine, and he urged the intelligence agency to step up its work to counter Western spy agencies. That speech comes as intense fighting continues around the town of Bakhmut in eastern Ukraine. Ukrainian forces say that the situation is getting dire and they are running out of ammunition. Let's bring in Steve Hall. He's a national security analyst and a former CIA chief of Russia operations. So Steve, I wonder, what was your takeaway from Putin's speech this morning? Was the point here to kind of rally the troops at a really tough moment in this war?
Yeah, certainly that's part of it. I mean, I think there was a lot going on in this speech, a lot that Putin wanted to try to accomplish. First and foremost was to, of course, try to increase the morale inside the FSB, one of the major security services, probably the strongest in Russia. They do have folks on the ground in Ukraine, like many intelligence services, security services. They have a wartime sort of paramilitary capability, both collection and also to conduct attacks and so forth. But as Putin alluded to, they also have a very, very important role that they need to continue playing inside of Russia, and that's the counterintelligence piece that he mentioned several times in the speech.
And he also urged the FSB to step up their operations to counteract Western intelligence services, who he says has boosted their operations. So I wonder, I mean, should the West, the U.S., and NATO nations be concerned about what this means for them in the near term?
I don't think it's a real change. These things are sort of going on in the background, and Putin mentioned them in his speech. But it's one big ball of responsibilities that the FSB have inside of Russia. So when Putin refers to counterintelligence, he's not just talking about the work of Western intelligence services and other intelligence services, although that's part of it. What he's really concerned about is dissidents inside of Russia. And there's an entire center inside the FSB that is responsible for not only monitoring, but also taking care of, eliminating, or as the Russians say, liquidating dissidents. And he's very, very concerned, I think, about that because of how poorly the war is going. He's got to monitor it very, very carefully.
Yeah, and they're taking a lot of casualties, those casualties going back to Russia. What effect all that will have, I think we are definitely all looking to see. Thank you, Steve Hall, for all of that analysis.